So what's up, people, and welcome to the Chapter 8 discussion of Bokura no Ketsumei, or Our Blood Oath. Yeah, so Chapter 8 came out a few days back, and as always, I will leave a link in the description section of this video to that chapter, which is currently being shown on the publisher's official website, Manga Plus, for a few weeks. So if you're interested, yeah, go take a look at it before the publishers pull this chapter back. Yeah, so Chapter 8. Chapter 8 was a very unique chapter. It took this story from 0 to 100 in the darkness factor really quickly. And it is very interesting because between Chapter 7 and 8, we are definitely seeing the story take a different turn. Up till that point, it was a story of relatively calm and peacefulness despite it being about vampires, and you saw a lot of people who read it comment and say, this is a relatively wholesome story. And one of the strong parts was the positive interaction between Shin and Ko, right, the two brothers. And for a vampire story, it was very lighthearted. And then Chapter 7 came, and Chapter 8 came, and oh boy, we're going down a dark rabbit hole. So Chapter 8 starts with Kiri. If you remember that young girl that came out in Chapter 7, the vampire girl. And she comes out again in Chapter 8, but yeah, she was a very interesting character. I mentioned in Chapter 7 that she's giving me Hinami type vibes from Tokyo Ghoul. You know, I don't know if she will be as important a character as Hinami was in Tokyo Ghoul, but it's definitely creating and setting up a very interesting support character for the story. But in any case, if you remember, Kiri was brought out in Chapter 7 to show the readers just how difficult it is for a vampire to avoid drinking human blood. The pain that they get, the addiction that they have, or the hunger that they have is so strong that it's really difficult to avoid. And since Kiri is a child still, she is the perfect character to show this because of the fact that she has difficulty, of course, controlling her urges and her hunger. And so it got so bad in Chapter 7 that, of course, at school, when she forgot her lunch of a blood pack, she attacked her closest friend, her BFF, Aki, to the point that she almost injured her. This devastated Kiri, and she stopped going to school and she shut herself into her room. And, you know, she was really sad about the fact that she lost her best friend. Well, what's really nice is that in Chapter 8, we find out that they're back together again, Aki and Kiri. And it turns out that Aki was so worried about Kiri and that she was not coming to school that Aki actually came all the way to Kiri's house to find out what happened and to hopefully urge Kiri to come back to school. Kiri apologized about the accident, and from Aki's perspective, she didn't care. She just wanted Kiri to come back to school. So it was very nice to see them back together again. And it would be a way to somehow turn this character's life around again and bring it back to the norm where she can go back to school. And of course, this segued well into the next part of the story where Kiri's mother was talking about, you know, the blood urges that you get when you're surrounded by humans because of the fact that the humans give this scent that makes a vampire very uncontrollably hungry. And yet Shin, considering he is a human, never really gave that scent. And we find out why is that when Shin was adopted as a human child into a vampire family, the father of the family asked Shin to consume a little amount of his vampire blood every single day. And by doing so, it changed his physiology so that he doesn't emit that scent that typical humans do that make vampires go raging out of control and hunger. And so, of course, Ko didn't even realize until all that devastation happened with their parents and he had to create a blood oath with his brother, right? It was at that point that he found out that Shin was human. And so this change in physiology may be the reason why Shin is so special, right? We talked about that in chapter 7. Why is Shin so freaking powerful that considering he is a human, he can outfight a standard vampire, right? And so maybe it's because he was drinking vampire blood that this changed his physiology, and considering the blood that he was drinking was royalty, then he may actually be more powerful than a typical vampire, right? That was the whole point with Ko, right? Once he charges himself with Shin's blood, Ko can become an extremely powerful vampire, even though he is a child, because he has the bloodline of a royal vampire blood. And it seems that maybe that is why Shin is also that powerful. We don't know yet, but that is one possibility. And this was an interesting way of bringing and introducing that to the readers through just this conversation. But of course, then we go to the dark side. And what we find out is, as we know, there are now indications of renegade vampires, or a different, darker vampire crew out there. And now they know about Shin and Ko. And for some reason, they want to bring pain to this brotherhood. And so, the best way to do that was to kidnap Kiri and Aki. And so, the rest of the chapter goes into Shin and Ko's actions to go rescue those two children. And I will leave it at this point. I don't want to go describe what happens in the latter parts of the story. But I will say that it does take this comic to a seriously darker part. And so if you're interested, once again, go take a look at it in chapter 8. But it may be important in a sense that it is now establishing itself as a vampire horror story. And I don't mind this at all. If this is the purpose to which the author was building up, and this was the plan all along to do so, then I have no problem with it, because the author is in control and they can write the story as they feel is right? The difficulty I find is that it took almost a 180-degree turn from chapters 1 to 6, and then suddenly in chapter 7 and 8, right? 7 and 8 are going in a completely different, darker direction than the previous chapters. So my biggest worry is that this isn't in the control of the authors, but the publishers demanded that they needed to see greater popularity in the story. And so despite whatever the author wanted, demanded that they take it to the darker side. And if that's the case, my biggest worry is now the story is going to move not the way the author wants it, but the way the publishers feel will make the most amount of money. And despite the fact that I do like dark stories, I am a little bit worried when publishers start stepping in and telling the author how to write their own stories. Now, I am not saying that that's how it is, but it is very curious that this story is not particularly the most popular one in Shonen Jump or Shueisha's line. And Shueisha is notorious in being cutthroat amongst all the different comic series. And so did that lore standing put a worry to the publishers that demanded the writers to change the story that will be more mainstream to the darker audience, right? And I am not sure. If that's the case, then of course, we're going to see more stories that are not particularly something that the author planned. And so why I worry about that is if the author didn't plan it that way, but the author is writing it, then you often get these conflicting story patterns because of the fact that nothing makes any sense now, right? The author is trying to write it the way he wants to write it, and yet the publishers are putting in whatever it is that makes it look, the shock value, right? And then that changes the story and conflicts with other parts of the story. It turns into a mess, right? If the author was planning this and can keep this going the way the author wanted to, then I'm perfectly fine with it because the quality of the story will probably not go down. But if we're now starting to do this just for the fan service of wanting darker stories, then I worry that the quality of the story will go down because there will be no continuity from one part of the story to the other. Anyway, I am not going to worry too much about it right now. I'm just going to keep an eye out on it and see how this goes. In any case, for people who like darker stories, well, maybe this will increase the popularity of the story. And if this was planned by the author, Kazu Kakazu, then then more power to him because of the fact that we may see a lot more complex tension come out in future chapters. But in any case, that was chapter 8. Once again, if you're interested, go take a look at it while it's still up. And I'll continue to follow Bokura no Ketsumei or our Blood Oath in the future. I hope you join me at that time. Until the next chapter, happy manga reading, happy vampire searching. And as always, Jaya, nice day, everyone.